Let's make sure healthcare is right there for us all. Health and well-being with just a call. Let's make producing food more sustainable, so feeding our growing world is attainable. Let's make our communities safer, smarter, and stronger. Let's make our home last longer. Let's make our technology work for good. Let's make the future friendly.
Good morning, everyone. I want to welcome all of you, University of Windsor students, staff, faculty, and distinguished guests to the Chancellor's Leadership Series. I believe this is our 4th event, and I'm proud to welcome all of you today. If you don't know me, I'm Mary Jo Haddad, Chancellor of this wonderful university, and I'm thrilled to be on campus for the last couple of days with the Honorable John Manley. Today, we are gathered on the traditional territory of the Three Fires Confederacy of First Nations, which includes the Ojibwa, the Odawa, and the Potawatomi. I offer my gratitude to Indigenous peoples for their stewardship, knowledge sharing, and teachings of and about these lands. I respectfully acknowledge the traditional territories from a position of understanding that my ancestors and I have benefited greatly from living on Turtle Island since we first arrived on these lands in the 1920s. My father taught us to respect the land, to cultivate it, and to replenish it, to live in harmony with nature, and to build and nurture our connections. As all of us continue the journey towards truth and reconciliation, may each of us reflect upon our obligations and recommit ourselves to action. So thank you all for taking time out of your busy days to join us for the 4th annual Chancellor's Leadership Series. I also want to thank in particular our sponsor Telus for sponsoring these series and importantly for helping me establish a scholarship for the University of Windsor students. And a scholarship is focused on leadership. I'm grateful for their support of my vision for recognizing students who have demonstrated an interest in leadership and a desire to lead with impact. And that really is behind the series today. And now, I am very pleased and very honored to introduce to you our guest of honor, the Honorable John Manley. John joined Bennett Jones LLP as Senior Business Advisor in September of 2019. He is best known as former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. He served in the Canadian Parliament from 1988 to 2004 as MP for Ottawa South. From 1993 to 2003, he was a minister in the government of Prime Minister Jean Chrétien, serving in the portfolios of industry, foreign affairs, and finance. No small jobs. In addition, he was the Deputy Prime Minister. After a 16-year career in politics, Mr. Manley returned to the private sector in 2004, where he has continued to be active in public policy as a media commentator, a speaker, advisor to governments from differing political stripes. In the private sector, Mr. Manley has practiced law and served as the President and Chief Executive of the Business Council of Canada. He's been very active as a corporate director and currently serves on a board of a number of organizations, including Telus. He is past chair of CAE and CIBC, including the bank's US subsidiaries. He knows a lot about a lot of things. John, you've inspired hundreds of leaders across the globe with your clear vision, your decisiveness, and your humanity. Your career is broad and your experience eclectic, but there's a common thread that is constant. You're a thoughtful and principled leader, and there is much to learn from your leadership journey. Your career has taken you on a fascinating journey from lawyer to public service and impressively to the top of the ranks as Deputy Prime Minister of Canada and as Director and Chair of the largest corporate boards in Canada. I'm sure many of you have looked at his CV. It is available on the website. And so I'm going to join John and maybe ask him to give us a brief kind of summary of the highlights of your career to get us kicked off for today.
highlights and lowlights. Can I throw those in too?
You can do whatever.
You know, I consider myself to be extraordinarily fortunate because I've had, you kind of scoped it out, but I've really had 4 careers. I trained as a lawyer. I practiced law. I threw my hat in the ring and found myself elected to Parliament, where I served in opposition, and then I was given wonderful jobs by Prime Minister Chrétien over the 10 years of the Chrétien government. I went back to law for a while, but then ended up running the Business Council of Canada, which is a great business association where I was able to do some really, I think, meaningful things as a leader of the business community, particularly you know, getting Canada's largest business corporations to support putting a price on carbon, which was counterintuitive for many at the time. I consider that to be an important contribution, establishing the Business Higher Education Roundtable to give students in secondary, post-secondary education an opportunity at work integrated learning. And then I've had a career in corporate governance. So it's been great. It's been at every step challenging, interesting, in some cases well compensated, some cases less so. But you have to understand that I consider all of that to be a product of sound public policy. I came from a home where my dad got grade 8 education, my mother got grade 9. My parents both suffered from tuberculosis. My dad came back from World War II with tuberculosis. I didn't even really see him until I was about 6. I saw him in the window of the Royal Ottawa Hospital where he had, which was a sanatorium for tuberculosis patients at the time. So we had very little money. My parents had very little education, but they believed that education was the ticket to do anything you wanted to do in life. And they made sure that whatever else I received in education, public education, public policy that ensured that a kid growing up in subsidized housing could get educated is the reason I had those 4 wonderful careers. So I think public policy, how we shape our society and our country, is really fundamental.
I couldn't agree more. You know, the series is really today about citizenship and how to be the best we can be as citizens of this great country. So when you started your career in law as a young lawyer, what were your aspirations? Did they take you to where you are today? Maybe share with us. There's a lot of students in the room. Share with us your aspirations in those early years.
Well, I kind of bumbled into law, to be perfectly honest with you, Mary Jo, because I did an undergraduate degree in political science and mathematics. That tells you a little bit how bifurcated my personality was. I always liked having math because you could look up the answers in the back of the book. Political science, you can go to the back of the book, but there are no answers. So that's true with the social sciences. So I took a little bit of time off. I went and I worked. I got a job in the Public Service of Canada, and I thought, oh man, I was, I guess, 21, 22 years old. I thought, if I do this for my life, I hope I die at 35.
Ooh.
And I thought, maybe I'll try law school. Like I kind of got a logical process. So I threw in an application. I threw in an application at the University of Ottawa Law School because I was living in Ottawa and that's where I wanted to be at the time. And lo and behold, I had a really high LSAT, I have to say. I was probably less distinguished as an undergraduate student, but I got a really good LSAT. And I got into Ottawa U Law School, and I hated it. It was in those days, Dean Feeney, who's legendary. If anyone's seen the old movie that was set at Harvard Law School, called Paper Chase. That was my first year law school experience. Dean Feeney would come in and said, look to your left and look to your right. One of you won't be here next year. And, people would snip pages out of the books, and it was very competitive, and I was surrounded by people whose family were lawyers, and they'd all been lawyers. I never even met a lawyer until I went to law school. So I wasn't really but I applied myself, and I was by then older than I'd been an undergraduate. I worked pretty hard. And when the grades came out, I phoned the law school, and I said, I've got my transcript here, and I said, where it says rank, what does that mean? Is that like your overall rank, or is it like quartile? And the woman in the office said, well, it's the quartile that you're in your class. I said, oh, okay. And she said, oh, but what's your name? I told her. She said, oh, no. You're first overall. Because for the top 10, we give them the actual rank. But after that, it's quartile. So you're first overall. And I went home to my wife and I said, I think I'd better go for second year, because it looks like I might have some capability at this. So no, I didn't have a plan set out. I applied for jobs during my first year thinking, I don't know about this. So I had a lot of uncertainty. I wasn't driven in any way to pursue law or anything else. I was finding my way, like a lot of early 20-year-olds are doing in the halls of this institution.
I think it's an important question, because I think yesterday we heard a number of questions from students. How do I get on the path you are on, and what are the steps I need to take? And I think your answers talked a lot about opportunity and circumstance and being open to what's in front of you.
Yeah.
Very good, very good. So you've had an incredible journey. We've highlighted a bit of that. So you're 20 years old again. What would you tell your 20-year-old self, having had the life that you've had?
Go to law school. At 20, I hadn't thought of that yet. Well, a few things. I think there are some things that I basically understood, and I would reiterate. One is, education is table stakes to do anything that's really interesting that you want to do in life. And that's true even if it's not an academic education. It's true if you want to be a carpenter, that you need, build the skills, get the skills and the knowledge that you need. So I would say pursuing education, number one. Number two, don't borrow money unless you absolutely have to. There's the old saying that when you owe the bank $10,000, the bank owns you. When you owe the bank $100 million, you own the bank. So don't borrow money. I'd say, relationships are key to satisfaction and happiness in life. Build friendships, retain them, nurture them, make sure you make the time for them. That was really hard in a political career, and some friendships didn't actually survive that, but others were made. But I think it's really a key part, and that you've got to kind of organize your priorities in life around what I call some concentric circles. Your family has to be the priority, no matter what else you're doing, and your responsibilities are, go beyond that, but they start there, and they don't end with your family and friends. They extend to the community and society, the country, the world in which we live, and that finding the pathway to make that difference that every individual can make, however small and incremental it is critically important. That's
pretty heavy-duty learning for a 20-year-old, I would say. But important.
Start with go to law school.
Go to law school, important life lessons. So we're talking about leadership, and you've obviously been a celebrated leader on every front. What are the things that you take out of as a leader? What's foundational to you? If there are aspiring leaders in the audience today, or leaders large in the roles today, if you were to offer advice or wisdom on leadership, and maybe from
Well, I tried to follow some examples, and I think some of them, they include, God gave us 2 ears and 1 mouth so we could listen twice as much as we talk. I've never been inspired by people that were talking a lot about themselves, so I don't really like to do this kind of thing very much. I think that it's important to understand the variety of points of view that are out there, and understand where people who have differing views are coming from. I'm terrified at the echo chambers of social media today, because I think it causes people to fail to understand, why other people think differently from them, why they have experiences that are different from them. I'd say a leader, I saw this with Prime Minister Chrétien, a leader needs to be able to make decisions. You have to listen, and you have to try to learn as much as, but ultimately you have to make decisions. And I think that what I discovered trying to lead a large department in the government, the way the system often works, and this is many systems, I'm sure it was the system at the hospital for sick kids, where the leader knows where he or she wants to go. The forces of support below do everything they possibly can to help the leader succeed. Where the leader doesn't know where he or she wants to go, then they scatter about doing all kinds of things, and there's chaos. You certainly see it in government departments where the minister doesn't lead. The bureaucracy is completely, they're engaged in everything. Minister might want to do that, and might want to do this, or might want to do this. When you say, here's where I want to go, as long as it's lawful and legal, my experience was that they would move mountains to try to enable you to succeed. So being decisive actually matters. Not thoughtlessly decisive, but you've got to come to a point where you decide. It's a key feature of leadership. And then lead by example. You want people who follow you to behave in a certain way, then you need to behave in that way. And that extends to, showing empathy to them and hearing what their problems and issues are.
So, given the eclectic roles you've had, would you say there's a difference in leadership as a lawyer, leadership and as a leader of a corporation, leader as in the public policy sense or political sense? Or do those tenets run through all of those?
Well, I think those basic themes are consistent. And every role has its own unique characteristics. I mean, lawyers are very independent. They don't, certainly they work in teams in certain situations, but the teamwork that's involved in a political activity is quite different. The number of stakeholders that you're dealing with constantly is much greater, and therefore, certainly my experience in politics, which has transferred well to business, is that you need a lot of antenna because you're dealing with stakeholders that have very varied interests. And why that experience has been useful going into the business world was that increasingly, certainly in the large corporations, and we see that, you and I at Telus, the number of stakeholders that our companies have to deal with is not something that traditional, business school graduate CEOs have thought about. They tend to be very focused on the financial metrics and performance. But increasingly, I believe that that our corporate citizens have to, we've got an acronym for it. It's called ESG, Environmental, Social, and Governance issues, which is kind of an umbrella for saying a corporation is not just a profit-generating engine. It's also a key actor in society and needs to look at the range of stakeholders. That was the political experience. That's kind of intuitive in politics because you've got to collect, at the end of the day, you've got to collect the votes. And they'll come from a variety of sources, and you've got to address needs that are sometimes difficult to reconcile. It's not necessarily intuitive in business.
I think that's been my experience as well. So we find ourselves today in a world fraught with dissension, polarizing leaders, subjective media, misinformation. Many citizens quietly accept the discourse. Some don't, but many accept it. I believe change starts with each of us as an engaged citizen for a better society, and that could mean all kinds of things. How can we be more engaged citizens and more effective leaders in a time and in an era where there just seems to be a lot of tension?
Yeah, some of those, your preamble underscores some things that I really worry about. As I said, I was kind of an early adopter of technology, and I was a math student, and I'm still kind of a frustrated not engineer. I might have told the 20-year-old to go to engineering school if
there
I
you
do
go.
that. Anyway, the technology, and I was industry minister when we were laying out the roadmap for the internet and connecting schools in Canada. And in fact, I created something called the Information Highway Advisory Council and found David Johnston to chair it. So that was his pathway to greatness. He was already principal of McGill University, and he took this on, and he gave us a really good roadmap. But if you go back to that first report that he published, two things will strike you. One is it's fairly prescient. It also comments that in the world today, there are almost 30 million people using the internet. Well, we got 30 million people in Canada using the internet today. Mm-hmm. So it's just gone. Right. It has been an avenue for amazing creativity, democratization of information, but it's also become, in some respects, an open sewer of the worst of humanity's instincts. And I think many citizens feel like they don't even want to go near public discourse because they're going to get maligned, attacked, pilloried. And I think that is a tragedy. So I think that the dangers of misinformation and disinformation, dangers to our electoral system, something we're talking about in the news right now. I think the tendency that has evolved especially in social media for people to isolate themselves in their own echo chambers where they only hear voices they agree with. I think these are things that really break societies apart. The fact that we don't have a common understanding of what the facts are is highly dangerous, in my view. It used to be that, our general media sources were curators of information. They may not have been an ideal system, but they kind of evaluated what was true, what was, factual, what was important. And you and I read the same newspapers. And so we could have a common discussion about, from a common fact base. Now that's less and less the case as the sources of information have become so disparate, and our newspapers have been suffering the result of it. I think that those are all great dangers, and therefore the obligation on us as citizens, if we want to have societies in which we would like to see our children grow up and our grandchildren, then we each have to take on some of the responsibility for offsetting those new pressures that could be very disruptive.
So clearly public policy plays such an important role in how our societies work. And I would say most of us don't spend time thinking about that. So again, it's an area of focus for you. It has been, I think, most of your career. How do we engage more in healthy discussion, in interest in public policy, and in trying to shape, again, as everyday citizens?
Well, I think being involved is the main thing, and that can take a variety of forms. I mean, I'd encourage people to be involved in politics only because I think it's an important avenue. It is a decision-making area, but public service is way broader than that, and it goes to NGOs, it goes to private institutions as well as public institutions. It's all around us. Avenues for engagement, avenues to help, whether it's supporting charitable causes or being a volunteer in charitable causes. It's where can I make a difference? Where can I actually contribute? That I think is key, and I don't think there's any other way for us to maintain the links and the ties that we need in a cohesive society than to be engaged with one another and to understand one another. I think there's a big responsibility on our political leaders as well, and I really don't like what I see developing. You see, especially, I think, so far in the United States, but we tend to be just, maybe a few years or a decade behind trends in the US in many cases. But I see two political parties that seem to be competing for narrower base of support. And that there's a tendency to play to division rather than to try to build unity. I teased one of my friends who's a former US ambassador to Canada about when he was going to get the apostrophes to put on either side of the word united on his embassy in Ottawa, where it says United States of America. They should have apostrophes at united. We don't move ahead as a society when we play up our differences. And particularly when we discredit anybody who we may see as different or on the other side. I think that's a tendency that will ultimately hurt us badly. So I think political leaders have a big responsibility, and I'd urge them to, be less ad hominem, to be less aggressive, to talk in more positive terms, to accept that people might disagree on the path forward, but still be motivated by the right instincts, that they want to build a better country. They just may not agree on exactly how to do that, but that doesn't make them bad people. That just means that they've got a different vision. And how do we accommodate different visions? How do we build a sense of common purpose? You look at the history of Canada, you've got to think, there was often a sense of common purpose. Mm-hmm. We did some great things as a country. I've become conscious of many of our failings, but that does not override the fact that we have built in Canada a marvelous model of a society that is inclusive, that has hosted people from every corner of the earth and give them a quality of life and standard of living that has been largely unmatched. And I think we only do that if you can bring together a sense of common purpose, of common vision. And I think it's a big responsibility of our political leadership to try to fuel that.
So the importance of dialogue, of discussion, of forums, of taking opportunity to be engaged. And yesterday you had again a wonderful opportunity with a whole host of students and a whole variety of questions. I think we were all over the map. But something that rang really clearly for me were these students were engaged. They wanted to have an impact in their worlds and in the world that they were trying to create for themselves in terms of career and what have you. So if you were, one of them asked, I'm going to ask you today in front of everyone, if I decide I want to go into the political arena, how do I arm myself? Or what are the things that are important for me to not just have great discussions with people, but to really embrace the role of a political leader? What was important to you, and how do you encourage others in the world where, as you said earlier, it's challenging and it's difficult and it's easy to say, not for me. I don't have what it takes to do this.
Yeah, and it isn't for everybody because it's a difficult life, let me tell you. I did it, I was in Parliament for almost 16 years, and I went through only 4 elections. We only seemed to have a majority governments in those days. We ran balanced budgets. It was a
different time. It was a different time.
What you need in order to take on those roles is you certainly, I believe, need to have a willingness to work with people. You have to be, you're going to spend a lot of time talking to people. And they are going to be very varied in their outlooks and what their needs were. I came from a well-educated riding, but also with quite a large population of recent arrivals, many of them refugees from a variety of countries. Their needs were very different from the people in the suburban bungalows that I also represented. So if you're not interested in people, you probably should pick something else. And if you don't want to talk to people, then you should probably pick something else. But if you're also interested in how do we fashion the solutions and devise ways to make the country better, that's the place to be. And I loved it. I spent, when I went into, when I was first elected, we were in opposition. I became the critic for science and technology, which I told you I was a frustrated non-engineer and scientist, and worked really hard on science and technology policy. Some things I then was able to implement when I became the Minister of Industry a few years later. One of the things that I tried to do when I was critic, they brought in a bill to create what was then the new Department of Industry, Science and Technology. I moved an amendment to the mandate of that department, which was set out in an early section of the statute, to make it also part of its mandate to advance the cause of sustainable development. It was pretty early. This was in 1989. The government defeated the amendment. 4.5 years later, I'm the Minister of Industry. First thing we do is we amend the Act to put sustainable development into it and begin to develop a group in the department that had expertise in environmental technologies. They were pretty fledgling at the time, 1993, but I offer it as an example of you can actually make a difference. And it took us, I got a program in 1996 called Technology Partnerships Canada. We committed 25% of that program to environmental technologies. Now, what I discovered at the time, this is one of the reality-facing things is that we couldn't spend the money. We didn't have enough companies in Canada. I mean, you can always spend money. You can throw money away. We didn't have enough companies in Canada that actually had an environmental technology that was promising, that had a market that was sustainable itself as a business enterprise to use the money. I think in next week's budget, we're going to see a big amount of money for that kind of thing. The difference today is that it is a legitimate, genuine industry. It's displacing traditional industries. It might be a little late, but I kind of feel like I was around for the beginning of that trajectory. So if you want to make a difference in the macro ways, that's an avenue to do it. And that's why I loved that part of my career as much as I did.
And you certainly exude enthusiasm about that. So let's just give a little window into that time when you were in government. You've been out for a long time. What was the highlight for you? When you think about impact, and I know you did lots of things because we've all read them, but was there a highlight in terms of the time you were either deputy minister or one of the ministers with huge and significant portfolios for this country?
Well, probably the most consequential moment, I refer to it as my moment of fame, was when I had to be the point person on the aftermath of 9/11. It wasn't the policy area that I was most passionate about, which is, was security basically, and the border. And we were saying to the students yesterday, it's a little hard to remember how people felt in the aftermath of 9/11, but it was a very traumatic time for citizens, not just in the United States, but in Canada. Not only did we have the attacks on New York and Washington, plane that went down in Pennsylvania, we had the anthrax attacks, we had bomb scares, we had all kinds of things, and people were genuinely concerned. And Prime Minister said, I don't want everybody going out talking about this. Manley, you go talk. And then I was made the counterpart to the U.S. Homeland Security Advisor in the White House, Tom Ridge, who later became the first Secretary of Homeland Security. We had to work out an accord on the border to make sure that the trade and commerce flows continued. We had to satisfy the United States that we were not some kind of exposed underbelly where terrorists would be entering their country. I say, some of this sounds a little bit quaint now, but at the time, this was really, really. So I had a very high-profile, focal role, and before I was given that responsibility, I had no idea that I could do it. And sometimes when they throw you into the game when you've been sitting on the bench for a long time, you discover that you've got skills you didn't even know you had. And that was a little bit my experience. It gave me the confidence, which probably I shouldn't have had, to run for Prime Minister myself later in my career. Some guy from Windsor beat me, but anyway, it's another story. But it was a highlight because it was enormously consequential.
I think all of us who were around then remember that time with fear and memories, of course. And I believe you were on the cover of Time magazine. So not only did we recognize leadership from you, but the world did.
So I got roughly 30 free copies of the magazine, which I still have in my possession.
And you promised me one, right? I'm going to get one? Okay.
I'll try to find it.
Okay.
I may have tossed them. I don't know.
So we're talking about border and relationship with the U.S. One of the questions from Marta Liardi Anderson from the Cross Border Institute asks if you could discuss the importance of government policies that impact the movement of people and goods across the Canada-US border.
Well, that kind of came out of 9/11. We did. I mean, this is so important for Canada. And the problem is, it's way more important for us than it is for the United States. So we are constantly having to reinforce the importance of the linkages between Canada and the US, and often Mexico, in our key sectors. I mean, especially in this area, it was always the automotive sector. We used to have to educate. Governor Ridge was a very good counterpart for me because, first of all, he had been the governor of Pennsylvania. As he told me, he lived in Erie, Pennsylvania. So he said, I could see Canada from there on a clear day. He knew from before I met him that Canada was Pennsylvania's largest export market. So when he went into the role on Homeland Security, he actually knew the importance of the relationship. But he called me one day after he'd visited a Cadillac plant in Michigan to say, now I was at this plant and now I understand what you've been telling me. He said, they showed me a chassis that was starting on the assembly line. And at that moment, it was, it had been pre-ordered by a customer in Illinois, and this customer had designated the kind of seats they wanted. And when that chassis started on the assembly line at whatever time in the morning, those seats that this customer had ordered did not exist. When it started on the assembly line, an electronic order went to, I think, to Woodstock, Ontario, where the seats were fabricated that day, transported to the Cadillac plant, crossed the border, and when the chassis got toward the end of its journey, when they wanted the seats installed, there they were. He said, now I understand why the border has to be so free-flowing. Because otherwise, that chassis stops while we wait for the seats because they're in a lineup at the border. And that, you could multiply that across sectors and industries. It is just, I think many people in Windsor understand this intuitively because they see it all the time. But for many Canadians, they just don't realize how highly integrated that border is and how critical it is to jobs and employment in Canada. That's why I think on the agenda between President Biden and Prime Minister Trudeau this week, this whole discussion around Buy America is quite key. It's going to be very hard to make progress because it doesn't, Buy America is not a Biden policy. That's a bipartisan policy. It doesn't matter who's in the White House. We're arguing with that. And intuitively, it's right. Why don't we just buy America? Well, because guess what? Pennsylvania's largest export market is Canada. What if we start buying Canadian only? And how does that make, it'll work, just everything's going to cost a lot more. So we've built some efficiencies, especially since the Free Trade Agreement, but in the auto sector going back to 1965 with the Auto Pact, to ensure that we had efficient production so that consumers could afford the goods, people got jobs on both sides of the border, and we supported one another. So this is key. And it's something that I worried about the day of 9/11. I was foreign minister. I was on an aircraft coming back from Europe on that day. And I had been conscious of the Millennium Bomber, who was a guy named Ahmed Rassam, who was a terrorist that our security forces lost track of. He was caught by accident trying to cross into the United States on the West Coast on his way to the Los Angeles airport, where he hoped to celebrate the transition from 1999 to 2000 by blowing the place to smithereens. And he had enough explosives in his vehicle to do it, and he was caught. And we got a lot of bad publicity over that. And when I was flying back on 9/11, I was thinking, oh my goodness, if these people started in Canada, we have a big problem on our hands. Because, and the border never technically shut down on 9/11, but practically it shut down because nobody knew what to do. Everything froze. And ultimately, we supported US authorities to get trucks moving again. And we saw this phenomenon again a little bit during COVID. We saw the truckers right out here try to stop things. This is very problematic for the Canadian economy. So keeping that border open, absolutely vital, has to be a number one Canada-US priority. And what I decided Tom Ridge was going to be my best friend, whether he liked it or not. And he actually still is a friend, so that worked. But I told my colleagues, I said, if you're the agriculture minister, I want you to make best friends with the agriculture secretary. Lawrence McCauley was the Solicitor General. He became the best friend of the Attorney General of the United States, who was a right-wing Republican from the Midwest. Lawrence and he hit it off like gangbusters. Lawrence did what he was instructed to do. You have to do that. It's in our national interest. It's in our people's interest. So
relationships matter.
Relationships are absolutely
Everything.
We think that these big institutions are impersonal. At the end of the day, it's about people. It's so important that the Prime Minister has a good rapport with President Biden. We know what happened when Donald Trump was president. I mean, I don't fault Prime Minister Trudeau for that at all. It was a dysfunctional relationship. He did the best he could, especially at the beginning. But this guy was a wingnut and hostile to Canada for reasons that are completely incomprehensible to me. It made life very difficult. He was moments away from canceling NAFTA when his agriculture secretary came in and showed him the map of where the votes were in Republican states who were going to be most hurt if he did that. When we started COVID, he stopped exports of PPE to Canada, even though the goods that were being manufactured largely by 3M they were made of goods that had come in from Canada in the first place and then made into PPE. This is not good when we don't have a good personal relationship at every level.
And I think Canadians have become way more aware about the border issues, certainly given the pandemic and what we've witnessed. So if you don't live on a border city, those of us in the room know this well because we live on a border city and we know how vital it is. But it's it's certainly an important issue for every Canadian as you back out. I can't believe how fast the time's going. I'm going to open up. I have a couple questions that were pre-submitted, but I think we addressed them. So I'm going to open the floor. Rochelle, I think you're out there. If anyone has a question for John before we wrap up. I apologize. I'm calling you John. Is that okay, John?
Yeah, as long as I can call you Mary Jo.
You can call me Mary Jo.
Thank you, Mr. Manley, for being here. We really appreciate it. My name's Fred, an alum of the university. Happy Telus customer too, by the way. The question I'll ask you, based on your experience in foreign affairs, with the current war going on in Ukraine, how important is it to Canada to continue to punch above its weight to protect the international rule-based order that's essentially governed the world for the last 70 or so years after the Second World War? And how do we do that with the relationships you talked about with our American friends?
Well,
great question.
First of all, you're right to identify it as a really important aspect of Canada's a small country with a relatively open economy, and we're more trade dependent than most countries in the world actually are. So a lot of our wealth and prosperity, our ability to fund our social programs to build the country that we want, depends on our ability to have access to those global markets. And the rules-based system is one that ensures that smaller economies, smaller countries are able to do that and have some recourse against economic bullying. So the fact that under Donald Trump for multiple years, the U.S. basically shut down the WTO, which is ultimately where the rules can be, if not enforced, at least deliberations can be taken that result in arbitral outcomes. They shut it down by simply refusing to appoint judges to the WTO Court of Appeal. This is hugely problematic for a country like Canada, because then we have no recourse other than diplomacy. We don't have the muscle to do it. So I think on that element, it's really important. I think on the you started with the broader context. This whole debate around defense spending, in our government, the Chrétien government, we weren't big defense spenders. But you have to remember that when we took office in 1993, the Soviet Union had recently collapsed. We had, basically, we lived in a unipolar world. The United States was the world's policeman and the remaining major military power. China was small and emerging. There were other nuclear powers, but not significant. Measures were taken to control the nuclear arsenal that the former Soviet Union had controlled. Ironically, one of the aspects of that was that Ukraine, which became an independent country as a result of that, gave up its nuclear weapons in return for a guarantee of its borders, something that Vladimir Putin disregarded in 2014 when he took Crimea back, which he's further disregarded, of course, over the last year. I think we Canadians need to be conscious of a number of things, and our defense spending needs to reflect that. One is that we have a very long, undefended Arctic border with Russia, which has proven itself to be a somewhat hostile neighbor. Secondly, that we've seen nuclear proliferation in the world, not just Iran getting closer and closer, probably within 2 years of having a nuclear weapon themselves, but also with North Korea improving its ability to launch a nuclear attack with missiles. I don't think they're very accurate, but for them, I think they would consider it to be accurate if they hit somewhere between Anchorage and Miami. And we have a lot of geography that's Canadian between Anchorage and Miami. So I think it's timely that Canada renews NORAD, that we should be part of the U.S. missile defense system because we're going to be subject to the risks for which it was designed. And I think we're going to have to pull our weight in military spending. And that is not something that is a rheostat you can turn on and off. You've got to recruit, you've got to build capability, you've got to equip. It took us years to decide to buy modern aircraft. I don't like any of this stuff. I was never Minister of Defense. But unfortunately, we live in a very dangerous world, and if we don't play a part in defending ourselves, then and our allies, then our isolation is not going to be in our favor. Whether you then move to the trade and economic file or otherwise. So I think it's crucially important. I think this is a really dangerous time. I've never believed that diplomacy of isolation worked well. For example, I totally agree with the government's decision not to shut down diplomatic relations with Russia, despite what's going on. I think we need to be engaged with China. We can have lots of views about what the Chinese are doing, but not talking is not a solution. And Canada's always been able to play a role as something of an honest broker in the past. And I know, as foreign minister, I went to Tehran. I met with the Iranians. I called my U.S. counterpart, Colin Powell, and said, here's what happened. Here's what they told me. Here's what I saw. Here's what I listened to. He thanked me. He said, I checked with him before I went. He said, oh, please go. So we can play that role, and we should be, that's one of our It's one of the little advantages that Canada has that, as Prime Minister Chrétien used to say, we get into rooms, the Americans aren't invited. And then afterwards, we go tell the Americans what happened in the room. That's a card for us to play. That's currency for us. That's information. It's valuable.
Great question. Thank you for that. We do one last, I know we only have a minute left, but is there one last quick question? Thank you.
Hi, I'm Sherry. You were talking about the importance of media, that people not be in echo chambers, that we need reliable sources of information. And we certainly don't want to open our systems up that we have media that becomes national and has a single voice like Fox Media in the States. How do we protect the media sources in Canada, and in particular my two favorites, CBC and TVO?
One of our colleagues on the Telus board used to run TVO, so she would echo that. I think that personally, I think some of the measures the government is taking to oblige payment for news sources is justified. I think that one of the shortcomings that we've had has been that as the economics of media have changed, that we have fewer and fewer reporters on the ground. We have almost, other than really CBC and CTV and maybe the Globe and Mail, there are almost no foreign correspondents anymore from Canada. We used to have them in many places around the world. The reporters that I often deal with don't even remember when Jean Chrétien was Prime Minister. So the media outlets have pushed retirements and, saved money by hiring very junior people. It's great for them, but they don't have any mentors to help them, build their careers. And so, I think that those are things that we need to worry about. I think that funding for the CBC has always been an important element. I think the CBC, though, has to also be held a little bit accountable for how it uses its funds. I know, for example, that many of their news and current affairs programming outlets were depleted in order to make a massive investment in their new format for the National, which was a catastrophic failure. Peter Mansbridge felt bruised any night that he didn't get 1 million viewers. And now the National on CBC is, they're doing well at 100,000. So you can never blame your customers. You have to make sure you're providing your customers what it is that they want. And I think having reliable sources also requires making sure that the formatting, the reporting, and the delivery is something that people want and are willing to watch. So I think it's critically important. I think we need to find some method of funding to ensure that we get reliable reporting. I think it has to be done very delicately because you cannot have government telling news agencies what to do, what to report, how to report it. That's completely controverted. But you do need to make sure that it's not just a Wild West show like we've observed in the U.S. So no good answer to that one, I'm afraid.
Unfortunately, our time is up, if you can believe. And on behalf
Because I gave too long an answer.
No, it was fascinating. We could be here for a couple hours, I'm sure. Thank you, John, for joining me the last couple of days, for sharing your wisdom, for sharing your expertise, for serving our country, and for sharing your time. On behalf of the university, sincere thanks.
Let's make sure healthcare is right there for us all. Health and well-being with just a call. Let's make producing food more sustainable, so feeding our growing world is attainable. Let's make our communities safer, smarter, and stronger. Let's make our home last longer. Let's make our technology work for good. Let's make the future friendly.